It's just showing some other. This is in the seedling field. So here's a. Actually, we thinned out the plants and took some out, and some berries dropped off on certain ones. So my advice for fast growth is no weeds or grass allowed during the establishment years. Now I don't know too much with the Haskap because we haven't planted it poorly, but we did this with cherries once. We planted strawberries between the cherries and plastic, and then we grassed it. And our cherry bushes at the end, where they had the grass competition, were this big. After 4 or 5 years, the other ones were this big, full production, and the ones with competing with the grass never grew up. I just talked to someone a few weeks ago in Alberta who planted right into grass. She didn't tell me that. She says, my plants are 9 years old and they're not really producing anything, they're really short. And I said, did you plant into grass? And she goes, yeah. So, 4 years you might get good production without any competition. Maybe it's 10 to 15 years or never if you're going to give it tons of grass. Now, actually there was one exception where we planted into grass and Bruno, which had been a convent that was turned over to the university for a while. And the nuns had put tons of compost in there for years and years. And we planted cherries with plastic, but it had a lot of grass and they did okay. Right? But it was super over fertile. So here's some of our plants 1 year after planting. Right, so they do tend to get a few berries here and there. Plastic mulch can do weed control, conserves water, cleaner fruit. Some of the organic groups don't like plastic and some do. And some of them say you got to take the plastic out before you come into production, or at least it used to be that way. And it's horrible to try to get that plastic out. Even if you get the plastic, say they're biodegradable if they're up in the sunlight, but the part that's under the ground is still intact. So we don't do plastic mulch anymore because we change our fields all the time. But it also maybe it makes the roots even more shallow, I don't know. But it might be worthwhile. It would warm them up sooner in the spring. So we basically have bare soil, tractor cultivation, hand weeding. Sometimes we've used pre-emergent herbicides after the second year if it's a really horrible spot. But we really had a hard time getting rid of that plastic mulch.
What's plastic mulch? Just ground up, or is it like the cup?
No, it's like on a roll, a sheet of plastic that's fed. It's usually about 1 meter wide, and you have a machine that pushes it out. I should have put a slide on that. I have slides of it.
I'll show those later, I guess.
Okay. So growing. So here's typically what happens, the growth cycle. The year of planting, these were planted actually the beginning of summer, and they had already been growing in the greenhouse for 3 or 4 months. So they really didn't do anything. They just stayed there. But they're building roots underground. Year one, after 1 year, almost every bud on that original shoot will break and start filling out. I'm actually going from field to field, not the same plant or anything. So by year 3, we can get something like that. Oh, I guess I've got a little flop. Oh yeah, that's not year 3 yet. Anyway, we originally thought we had to stake these things up years ago, and that was a complete waste of time because anything there makes a shoot go up. So year 2, some plants have fruit, maybe a handful of each. Growth really takes off in the second season. Year 3 is the frustrating year. The plants are almost big enough for the machine to harvest, but it's only going to pick half the fruit, right? So then you go, oh, there's so much out there, and I can't pick it. And some people get people to go in afterwards, and some don't. Year 4 or 5, and it's kind of hard to see because there's a hedgerow behind, but I couldn't get a good shot, it was near the hedgerow. So that was about up to here, right? And that's when, now you're getting like 80% of your fruit or more is being harvested by the machines. There we go. Now we have some 17-year-old Haskap original 4 varieties. They range from 5 to 8 feet tall. I need somebody with a lot of sheets to go behind these plants to show them, but one of them is like 8 foot tall. I did see in Japan one that was like 12 feet tall. I'm not sure that any of ours will do that. To give you an idea how hardy these plants are, these are Haskap plants thrown outside the greenhouse with no cover in little, there's like 4-inch pots. One year my technician was supposed to cover the plants and he forgot, and we had every plant survive, just tossed out on the ground, and furthermore a lot of those little pots had berries in them. So it's super hardy, like there's no need for protection like that. There's just a close-up of a Russian variety. I'd love to say this over again. But this also said, we also did greenhouse studies with sitting plants and constantly in water. Like they had a pot and then we had another pot that was half its length and it sat down in the water and they all lived. But we did find in 2010 fields that had water on the field all summer long were able to kill off Haskap. Right? I probably prefers loam or sandy loam. Less desirable would be pure clay or sand because the clay would be too hard to get in their harvest and sand would need constant watering. Generally we're saying 1.5 meters between plants within a row. Haskap doesn't sucker, so it's not filling in. We go 3.5 meters between row because we're trying to put so many plants, many varieties in there. But it depends on how big your tractor is and your harvesting machine that you're dragging behind it. You have to remember to leave space at the end of your rows to turn your harvesting equipment around. Like for example, our harvester is probably, I don't know, 15 feet, 18 feet long. Then you add the tractor. So we had unfortunately planted some, before, we never dreamed we'd get the harvester, but when we did, we couldn't harvest many of our fields because it would mean we'd have to run over the last 10 feet of each row. So you've got to have that space, open space in mind. So a few long rows are better than many short rows. Now there's the year we staked it up. Now we plant our plants much closer. If you ever visit the university, we plant enough for 4 or 5 acres in 1 acre because we want to see what the fruit quality is first, and then we move the plant to another location to see what it's really like later on. Or we kill all the plants around it, let it grow without competition. So with the wild Haskap, it falls over and roots. Do we do that in order? I haven't really seen it really falling over and rooting in an orchard. In the wild, it tends to fall over and leaves will fall and create a new soil. But anyway, this is just pointing out that side. There's a little difference in the greenhouse they're staking out to make more room. So bushes need occasional thinning, but I would say you don't try to sculpt a Haskap plant like you do an apple tree or anything like that. It's better to just lop off one of these main branches once in a while, let a new one come out, like renewal pruning, right? This is, I think, about a 5-year-old plant, and we may have cut out one or 2 branches. There hasn't been studies with Haskap on renewing it, but with Saskatoons, they recommend only remove up to 20% of your plant in any year. So it would be really simple. You know, this one looks like it's got 6 main stalks. Next year, take one of those out and let some new ones form. I suppose if you had a bunch of new ones all in one spot, you might thin them, but it could be really fast pruning. this is a plant growing in our Patterson garden that no one ever pruned properly. And it's, the record said it was 30 years old. And I saw a lot of these in Japan like that, well, a few of them in Japan. But that's so thick and they're like a machine, that's devastating to a machine trying to harvest. But I think that also reduces your fruit quality because the berries are getting crowded. It would be so much easier to just cut some of that stuff out. I don't know if I have pictures of it, but we decided, in Saskatchewan it's very common for people to let their Saskatoons grow out of control. They'll sometimes get 15, maybe even 20 feet tall as a record. And they'll let them grow so tall you can't pick any fruit. And then they'll mow everything to the ground. And then they'll let it come back a few years later. And that's their idea of pruning. So we tried that with Haskap. We had this old row of Borealis. And I thought, well, what would be the worst time to do that? Would have to be end of July, early August. Because then it might make new growth, which might go into winter and get damaged. So we mowed it down, not even pruned it, but we took a mower so it made nice shredded, horrible things. Every plant survived. Every plant is now producing nicely a couple of years later. So you really could abuse them if you overplant and never do your pruning properly. But I think it's so easy to just go every plant take out an old trunk when they get maybe 5 years old. So I would say no pruning on young plants. 4 to 6 years old, start thinning. Remove the centers. It depends on your harvesting machine. If you have the sideways harvesting machine, which wants to open up the plant and bend half the branches over, you want to get rid of the middle. But if you have an upright harvesting machine, then you want to make your plant look flat like your hand with branches going within the row but not out too much. Another thing we found that, and because we were actually, maybe you should probably start thinning the year that you're harvesting by a machine, if you're going to harvest by machine. We found that some of our plants, and this is the seedling field, they winked over, touched the ground, and then the mud got carried into the harvesting machine. So we should have gotten rid of that. So renewal thinning maybe after 2 meters. Uneven ripening could be caused by either genetic predisposition. It could also be caused by too much rain during the pollination. You know, it's not a rainy day, they get pollinated. It rains 3 days straight, nothing gets pollinated, then something else gets pollinated. So that makes it uneven. But also this lack of pruning could cause the inner berries not to ripen as fast. You could also, if you had some damage to branches, well, we don't usually see Haskap getting damaged, that sometimes things are slightly damaged and they bloom later. So my Russian friend, who's head of the gene bank for fruit, and he got his PhD on Haskap, he says when a branch gets 5 years old, after that, get rid of it, right? And if you follow them, they have less and less growth to maybe they're only growing 3 nodes or so, then you get rid of that. I suspect because it fruits so early, and that study we did, why not prune them out after your harvest season? You know, maybe even the 5-year-old branches might tend to be a little more damaged anyway. You don't have to do it in the winter, just prune it out then. So yeah, there we go. Traditionally late winter, fall, but what I already said, so we can mow them down. Oh good, I did have that. Yeah, the plants actually didn't grow that season, so we thought, oh, we did kill them. Okay. The last topic is birds and pests, and Henry's probably going to talk about it, but Haskap really doesn't have any birds and many diseases, but birds are the #1 culprit. And if you get 1-inch mesh, your birds will get their heads stuck in the mesh. This was the case where they got inside the bush and couldn't get out. And they'll actually, you can pull them out. It's illegal to kill them, by the way, because they're a migratory international bird. But there they are, they look kind of pretty up there. Woolly aphids love, there's always something bad with everything. Deer love to eat cherries, birds love Haskap berries. So anyway, get the, these noisemaker things don't work, they work a day and a half. I watched, this is at Oregon, it started out with this many birds, every day the population doubled for the week I was there. And there was kind of later in the week.
Were those starling birds?
No, those are cedar waxwings, which have a sporadic migration pattern. So there's different kinds of netting. You really need the netting, this is in North Dakota, you really need your netting to be above the plant, because otherwise they could sit on your netting and peck through and get the berries. This is in PEI method they did. They did really grand, expensive netting. Diseases, and these are mostly what we see in breeding fields, and we don't select these, but that's botrytis. Very common in Oregon, but hardly ever happens in Saskatchewan. This is, one seedling is resistant, there's one next to it in our breeding field, right? So maybe you'll see something like that, but probably not on other varieties, I hope. Powdery mildew is the only disease we see in Saskatchewan, but we've selected for plants that are resistant to that. But that's how bad it can get on some of the Russian varieties. There's a milder case. It usually happens after harvest anyway, so it doesn't, maybe don't notice it as much. This is actually probably thrip damage. The plants are growing for a month, and then the thrips come out, but there's only the last two leaves being formed, so they get damaged, and the rest of the plant is beautiful. And do you really need to spray for that? No. Like, it's not really going to impact, but it looks weird to have a couple mottled leaves on top. There's ladybugs, larvae. They love Haskap, so they must be eating something, but I haven't figured out what it is. This is sitting in water too much, iron chlorosis. There's mildew on that plant. More mildew with a little thrip damage. There's mildew. You hardly ever see that white powder off. If you get one rain, it's gone, and it looks brown most of the time. There's more. That's just rubbing against a branch. Like you might, oh, I got a disease, or sunburn. The other thing is sunburn, and even plants kept in the shade house and moved out. They were in the shade house for 2 or 3 weeks. They moved out, I planted one day, and I came back on Monday, and they got sunburned. That's another reason for having dormant plants, perhaps, but it's something that only happens that first year of planting, usually. And, oh, there's a beehive, that's not part of the top. Okay, so now I'm done. I wanted to mention that we get funded by lots of people, but plant sales and royalties, the royalties don't go to me, they go to the program. 65% goes to my control in the program, but that doesn't mean I can go to Hawaii for a conference. You know, someone has to approve that. But 65% directly benefits more research. The other 35% goes to the equipment fund for horticulture. So I get that money back, but it forces me to save for a new tractor or harvesting machine. So that's, actually now royalties are funding half the program, so, and a lot of our graduate students. So anyway, that's it for, am I on time?